Time is of the essence. We've got some amazing winemakers and some amazing wines, and I want to make sure that we don't short anybody on time. So welcome, and welcome everybody to the Wine and Spirits magazine and Master of the World presentation of the best of Oregon Pinot Noir. We're extremely excited to be here with you today. For those of you who were with us last week, this is the appropriate bookend, if you will, to our California seminar by celebrating the best of what's going on in Oregon's Pinot Noirs. And for those of you who were not with us last week, I would encourage you to go back and actually, if you can, which you can, take a look at the webinar from last week's session 2, which is going to be archived on Master of the World's website, and see what we're doing here. So without further ado, I'm going to go knock out all this housekeeping stuff that we always have to do at the beginning here. Not that you're not all Zoom experts at this point in time, but suffice to say, for those people who, if this is your maiden voyage on Zoom, you're so lucky. We've been spending the last year doing this, but nevertheless, don't be afraid to ask questions. Questions should be asked initially through the Q&A function there, and they will be answered. Please make sure that you're selecting all panelists and attendees so everybody can see what's going on. Our panelists will not only join in and talk about their wines at the appropriate time, but I will also encourage them to, if they are seeing questions that come in on the Q&A feature when they're not talking, if it's specifically directed at you or something that you have a great answer to, please feel free to answer that in the Q&A section. For those of you who are also in the chat section too, please feel free to engage. We encourage hellos, not only where you're from, but long lost friends you haven't talked to in a while. So please say hooray and all that other good stuff. And then finally, as we do at the end of last week, and we do at so many of our Master of the World sessions, we would encourage you to stick around for our happy half hour afterwards. An hour is a long time, but we'll give you 30 minutes afterwards. All the winemakers will join us, and it's you can turn on your camera and join us as well too, and ask questions directly of the winemakers because they have so much to say. So enough initial housekeeping. I am delighted, privileged, pleased, honored to be joined by my cohort in crime today, who will be doing 90% of the heavy lifting, and that is Patrick. And Patrick, as you know, is the senior correspondent over at Wine and Spirits magazine, overseeing not only Oregon Pinot Noir, but so much of North American wine in general. I've been a fan of Patrick's for a long time. I consider him a good friend, and anybody who doesn't have his American Rhone book on their bookshelf should make a beeline to Amazon or wherever to go get one. I'm just waiting for his Oregon Pinot Noir book to come out at some point in time. Maybe he'll talk to us about that later, or maybe that's enough encouragement for him to do so. But he's going to be leading us through a lot of this today. As you can see on the left-hand side, this is part of the April issue, which not only is a great celebration of so many of my colleagues in the restaurant business with the 32nd annual restaurant poll, but as you can see from the lower left there, this is a celebration of the best of American Pinot Noir, Oregon style in this case. So what I'd like to do is sort of kick it off and throw it out to you, Patrick, because I'm sure everybody out there in Zoom land would really like to know, when you're looking specifically for greatness in Pinot Noir in Oregon, and you and I talked off camera about this earlier, that there is an Oregonness, if you will, about wines that defines them and what they are. What is it that specifically you are looking for? And in the context of looking at the variety via the place, the relationship between the two of those, because we are really looking at place. And Pinot Noir happens to be, I don't mean to dumb it down, but the crucible, the vehicle that is demonstrating place here. And I'm sure everyone would get great insight into hearing your thoughts on this.
Well, thanks, Evan. I think it would be so cool if we had a California Pinot Noir to compare these 6 wines with, because they are the differences between the two are so remarkable. Last week's flight was a great tour of California, but it also reflected California's warmth and sunniness, its warm summers and its cool evenings. But you really you are in a different land when it comes to Oregon. Now, I'm going to start by just saying that the Willamette Valley is an enormous place. It's 3.4 million acres. Only 22,000 are planted compared with, say, 43,000 in the Napa Valley alone, which is quite a bit smaller than the valley. And so almost from its inception, they started to subdivide the place into sub-AVAs rather quickly. All of that kind of culminated in 2006 when they established 6 AVAs, all of which feel to me quite distinct from one another. And we're going to explore at least 4 of those today. But more generally, we're talking about wines that are coming from a much cooler place than California. You're going to find that they're much lighter in color, they're lighter in weight and in extract. They're going to be more savory and attenuated in their aromatics. And they're going to have a much higher level of acid, a lively acid structure that typifies all 6 of these wines across the board. And then the other thing that really, to me, amounts to the most Oregon of Oregonness is a kind of inner tension that is related to that acidity, but really just speaks to where it kind of lands on the palate. It doesn't take over the mouth. It kind of dances above the mouth, and it has energy and flow like that is fairly rare in a conventional California Pinot Noir, for example. For that reason, they're sometimes compared to Burgundy, but the Oregon is very unique. It doesn't really correspond to Burgundy, despite the fact that it is coming from roughly the same latitude on the Earth, and it really does feel like a very unique, singular place.
Great. I love that. I hope everybody out there starts, as I am doing, adding Oregonness to their vocabulary. It's becoming as strong a part of my vernacular as talking about balsamico when I talk about Rioja, and now I talk about Oregonness in Pinot Noir. So before we jump into the first wine, just some rules of engagement for everybody that's out there. A few pointers. First of all, for those of you who have kits, and I realize not everybody out there has a kit, and by the way, you don't need to have a kit initially to enjoy this webinar, and if you get tempted to buy one afterwards, you can always go back and listen to the webinar when you're trying it. But if you haven't opened your wines out, please do. Pour them out, and if you ideally in a perfect world have 6 glasses to have them all side by side so you can cross-reference wines, that's great. Remember that oxygen is your friend. These wines have been cooped up in their little 187 milliliter bottles for a while, and when they can jump out of the bottle like Genie, they're happy to be out and stretching their legs a little bit. And the more air you get into them, the more expressive they will be in due time. Probably in about 20 or 30 minutes, they will really start showing well. Please feel free to engage your glasses. Do not wait specifically for Patrick and myself to ask you to try the wines and jump into them. They will all be led by Patrick and their associated winemaker vintner at the appropriate point in time, but do not, if you want to jump ahead or come back, you should feel free to do so. The flight is going to be done in pairs. So that is to say, we'll be sort of talking about wines 1 and 2, then wines 3 and 4, and then wines 5 and 6 together. But obviously, we'll speak to them individually. And as I mentioned earlier, you should feel free to move. Now, last but not least, for many of you who are out there, this is in fact a blind tasting. And if you want to do it as a blind tasting, that's great. For those of you who don't know, all of the wines that people have out there have this same front label that says Master of the World, but they're all sleeved afterwards, and they're held together, that sleeve, by a little sticker that has the number of the wine on it. If you want to keep it blind to yourself, don't peel off the sticker and identify the wine. But if you simply would like to know what we're doing at the time that we're doing it, and you want to jump ahead and you say, hey, Evan, I don't feel like playing today, peel off that sleeve, and it will reveal all of the information, as you can see here. Got one of my ones from last week that you see it with all the information would be there. That's a California wine, but that's okay to show you the reveal. I don't want to jump ahead too much. All right. So on that note, we're going to go ahead, and what I'd like to do is have Patrick maybe just kind of situate us kind of where we are. We're going to be moving around, as I said before, and as we move into each wine, I will give the heads up for those of you who are doing it blind that we will be revealing wine 1, wine 2, etc. So any thoughts before we jump into this wine 1 now that people have a map in front of them, Patrick?
I think the first thing you should know about this wine, which is actually pretty clear when you put your nose to it, is that this is a wine that reflects one of three soil series that are common to Oregon. This one reflects a Jory soil sequence, which is the volcanic soil sequence that is common to Oregon. And the thing that distinguishes the Joriness of this wine is the kind of the high-toned red fruits that are found both in the nose and on the palate. Jory is volcanic, and it has almost an irony note to it, and I picked that up in this wine right away. Dundee Hills are the first place that that Pinot Noir was planted in the Willamette Valley. This is where Jason Lett's father planted in the late 60s. And it is the hotbed for Oregon Pinot Noir. It's where many of the established wineries and brands that we all know and love from Oregon got their start. And so, let's
go ahead and reveal the first wine then. And with the next slide, we're going to see, first of all, just a reiteration of the Dundee Hills here. Again, you can sort of see it called out. And our first wine is, in fact, it is from Jason Lett. And this is the Irie Sisters Pinot Noir. Please take it away, Patrick.
Well, Jason, I'm delighted by this wine. I think that this is one of it epitomizes what Dundee can produce in terms of its concentration, but also of its lift. There's something very succulent about the way the wine plays on the palate, and yet it remains very light on its feet and really has a tremendous movement. This is an older planting, but by no means the oldest planting at the Irie Vineyard. And now I think it's time for Jason to tell us a little bit more about Sisters and about what he typically expects from this particular block on the property. Jason?
Well, thank you, Patrick. It's great to hear you talk about the wine. I'd rather you talk about it than me. So I'm Jason Lett at the Irie Vineyards. I've been making the wine here ever since I was a little kid, but mostly in an assistance role. I didn't move into the winemaking role here until 2005, although I have plenty of experience here before then. The wine that we're drinking right now is the Sisters Pinot Noir. This is from our lowest elevation vineyard. So if you're looking at this map down on the lower on that picture that's up in the top left corner of your screen, you'll see the 5 different vineyards at the Irie. Altogether, our estate makes up about 62 planted acres. All of that's managed organically, and all of it's managed no-till, which is what the big picture in the middle is all about. It's kind of showing you what the ground cover looks like there without any plowing intervention. So the Sisters Vineyard is the lowest elevation vineyard. It's the one kind of off on the right. If you're familiar with the Dundee Hills at all, it's just below Archery Summit. That's an interesting area because, as Patrick alluded to, it's Jory soil, but the lowest elevations there have a little deposit of sedimentary soil over the top, soils that were left by the Missoula floods. And so it's really interesting to taste the wines as we go up from that lowest elevation vineyard to outcrop in the Irie, which is kind of at our next elevation tier at about 200 feet in elevation. And we go up to 550 feet in elevation at the Rolling Green Vineyard, and then finally finish at 860 at the Daphne Vineyard. As you go up the Dundee Hills, 3 things happen. It gets cooler because, you know, as you rise in elevation, spring starts later and fall comes sooner. It gets windier because, as we'll probably get to hear from maybe another winemaker in this panel, we have an effect from a gap in the mountains called the Van Duzer Corridor that brings winds in from the coast. And the last thing that happens is the soils change. You get more and more and more irony, as Patrick put it, in the soils and in the wines, the higher you go. So as you look at this Sisters Pinot, you're going to see that the color here is quite light. I find that as we go higher up in elevation, the wines become more and more blue. So as you look at the color on this, you're going to see just a little bit of a brick edge to that. And that to me really defines what to expect from wines that are grown in this lower elevation Jory soils where you get a tiny bit of influence from the sedimentary as well. Additionally, this is a 2017. I think it's a really outstanding vintage for Oregon because it really reflects sort of what Oregon does best. It was a warm summer, one of the warmest on record, but we entered a real cool harvest season, and it really brought the wines back into focus again, gave us that acidity back, what you really expect from a classic Oregon vintage. So I think a lot of Patrick's tasting notes on this wine are really on point, and especially true of 2017, which I think is a really classic vintage and which reflects Oregon's Pinot Noir heritage really well. This wine itself, the Sister's Vineyard, it's not a wine that my father made. Our single vineyard Pinot Noir weren't bottled separately until 2012. We had always kind of made what we called a reserve, which was from our original vines, the ones that were planted in 65. But something that I decided to undertake was to see how these bottles actually aged. So rather than blending it all together and just putting it into our estate, I started putting aside just a couple hundred cases of each wine and labeling it separately to see how that would evolve. And so while this is, Patrick's kind of calling this a historic cuvee, it's actually kind of new to me. And I'm just using it as a learning vehicle to try to understand how these different sites are going to age over time. Really feel like we're kind of in a race with climate change to understand our region in new ways. And it's really important to get as much data, if you will, as you can from each different site to know how to respond as things, continue to move and change and morph.
Jason, is it fair to say that the Dundee Hills is one of the warmer, or at least expresses warmth more readily than some of the other sites in the Willamette Valley?
Not necessarily. Everything is very microclimate focused. You can kind of look at the Willamette Valley as like this big triangle with Portland up here at the top. And then the point of the triangle is Eugene down here. And then we're sandwiched between two mountain ranges. To the west, we've got the Coast Range, and to the east, we have the Cascades. All of our water comes from the coast. It climbs over the top of the Coast Range. The Coast Range scrapes off about 7 feet of precipitation a year. So when that stuff comes in from the Pacific, like Tillamook gets 10 feet of rain a year. We get just over 3 feet. So all of our water and all of our coolness, I guess you could say, is coming in from the coast. The Coast Range scrapes off a lot of that. It sails over the valley, it deposits a bit more rain, but then it hits the Cascades. And the Cascades force the clouds up. And as they do, they wring the water out of the clouds. And so that eastern side of the valley, even at the same latitude, is quite a bit cooler just because of these sort of, mesoclimate effects that happen as clouds move around the valley. So the Dundee Hills also has, pretty complex structure. As you can see from this, you can almost represent it as a fist. And there's a number of different exposures there. And so there's a lot of microclimates in the Dundee Hills, and you can see a really wide range of expression.
Okay.
That's so cool. Thank you, Jason. Appreciate that. And again, just as a reminder, all of the winemakers will join us afterwards. So if you have specific questions, you can ask them in person during the happy half hour, and you should again feel free to drop your questions into the Q&A feature. And in this case, Jason will answer them. Thank you, Jason. And what a great kickoff. And I think it's so appropriate that you and your family kick off this entire session of wines. A great narrative here. So we're going to move now into our second wine. And as we switch slides out here, our second wine is going to be from the Van Duzer corridor. So it's not necessarily per se the same place. And you want to take us a little bit through this, Patrick, before we reveal the identity?
Sure. I think you want to keep some of what Jason said about climate in mind as we look at the Van Duzer corridor, which is the newest appellation of the ones we're going to look at today. It was established quite recently, I think 2019. So it is very new to the sub-AVA pantheon in the Willamette Valley. Doesn't mean that there weren't vineyards planted there. I'm going to let Morgan talk, let the winemaker talk a little bit more about the climate there, but basically the Van Duzer Corridor AVA is named for a wind gap that goes directly from the ocean, which you can see there on the left hand of the map there, into the Willamette Valley. And needless to say, the warmth of the valley draws in wind, moisture, and coolness with tremendous speed and very, very high winds. And so the southern end of the valley that's closest to that corridor really feels the brunt of it in a very real sense. And I think you can smell that in this wine right away. You smell the kind of a thickness of skin, if you will, and you can certainly see a dramatic difference between the color of, say, wine number 1 and wine number 2. And I think that is directly as a function of the wind that this vineyard must experience as it whips over the vines on this western part of the southern Willamette Valley.
And clearly, it's almost like the grapes are protecting themselves, developing thicker skins, and absolutely more anthocyanins. So, spoiler alert for those of you who actually know Morgan, but our next wine is from Johan Vineyards from the Van Duzer Corridor, and terrific winemaker. Patrick, back to you.
I'm thrilled to taste this wine in this context, and I'm thrilled that Van Duzer is representing, so to speak. It really is an exciting appellation because of how dramatic the terroirs are from that area. And Johan is, I could be wrong, Morgan, but it's one of the few established wineries in that area, although there are a number of vineyards that can be found in and around that area. And so I think maybe the best way to start is just to have you, Morgan, give us an introduction to the Van Duzer Corridor as you perceive it, and Johan specifically.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I've been at Johan since 2015, so still relatively, I guess, new in the kind of scene here in Oregon, but yeah, the Van Duzer Corridor was established in January of 2019, as Patrick mentioned earlier, and we are one of the newer AVAs or sub-AVAs in the Willamette Valley. It is a pretty large, you can see on that map, a pretty large kind of triangular swath that is right at the mouth of that big east-west gap that goes out to the ocean. And on those warm summer afternoons, as the valley heats up, it creates a heat sink and pulls in the cold ocean breezes to kind of cool the entire valley, but we happen to be right in the mouth of that corridor. So yes, very high wind speeds. Good luck to ever having an umbrella or anything out on a summer afternoon at Johan. It's impossible. It's like a light switch at 2:30 or 3 o'clock every afternoon. You feel it for sure.
The appellation reflects a different soil series than what's found in the Dundee Hills. Is that correct? And tell us a little bit about the soils that are at Johan Vineyard.
Sure. Yeah. So as opposed to the volcanic soils up in Dundee, we are definitely on the marine sedimentary side. So the kind of unique thing about our area is it kind of tightens up just south of us, and there was almost a dam that, as the Missoula floods were coming into the area, dammed up, and we have a large percentage of erratic granite. So large chunks of granite are found in our vineyard, and we're no longer tilling our vineyard, but when we were bringing the till through, we would find large chunks of granite pretty often. So that's kind of a unique thing with our area, but marine sedimentary is definitely the majority of the soils that we see.
For those of you who don't know what Morgan's referring to, the Missoula floods were literally a cataclysmic flood that originated in Canada, on the border of Canada, that flowed all the way across the eastern Columbia Valley and essentially dumped itself like a bathtub in the Willamette Valley and carried with it in the ice and water flow, erratics from Montana, Canada, British Columbia, not British Columbia, but the other one next to it. Anyway, it is that particular spot is a place where there are a number of large erratic rocks from ostensibly Canada. In fact, there's a little county park, as I recall, not far from your vineyard, that has one of the biggest ones, which is, it's bigger than a car. It's enormous. It's amazing. So talk about this wine a little bit. It is a fascinatingly savory wine reflecting tremendous cool climate character to me, and depth of flavor.
Yeah, so 2017, I think, as Jason kind of alluded to, was a little bit more of a, I don't know, I guess in comparison to the 3 years prior to that, which were a string of warmer vintages, 2017 was a bit of a kind of movement back to the normal Oregon. We had a really wet and cool winter, and we did have a warm spring, as Jason mentioned, or sorry, summer, as Jason mentioned. But as we moved into fall, it cooled down, and we started picking in September, and we were really fortunate in that we didn't have any of those rain events that we're used to juggling here in Oregon. So we had a nice, beautiful fall and lots of flexibility in terms of our picking windows that year. No real heat spikes in the fall, and we could pick long into late October and early November. We, in general, on our site, and I think just across the board with marine sedimentary soils, you often see more of those savory qualities in the wine. But I would say that's a pretty typical thing for Johan. We see a lot of salinity in our wines, lots of, I guess in red wines, it shows more in kind of a sanguine nature. We do work with a good amount of whole cluster fermentation. And I think Jason also mentioned this, that it was a great year with beautiful natural acidity. So with that cool fall, we were able to have the flexibility to harvest and keep that nice natural acidity and nice chemistries coming into the winery. So we did play with a lot of whole cluster fermentation that year. And I believe this wine was right around 60% whole cluster said and done. This is our kind of estate blend. So I try to get at least one barrel from each of our small fermentations across the entire vineyard. We have 10 different clonal selections, and multiple of those are on a couple different root stocks. So kind of a wide range of things to blend and diversify with. And for me, this wine is the most representative of our site in a given vintage. The Pinot Noir is not sectioned to one portion of the vineyard. It's spread across our 87 acres. We do have 16 different grape varieties growing, so lots of diversity across the board, but also a good amount of diversity in our 10 clonal selections of Pinot Noir as well.
Great.
Thanks,
you,
Morgan. This is for those people who are not familiar with this new AVA and all of that. I don't think, Patrick, we could have done a better job of picking a wine that would give somebody an introduction to the typical character and concur. The diversity of savory herbs and flavors in this wine is really underscores a unique personality and a wonderful pairing here. So as you start wines 3 and 4 and start looking at those together, everybody, we're going to move now into a singular area. So they share the appellation, the Eola Amity Hills. And Patrick's going to take us through them as a pair. Obviously, we'll talk about the wines, and the winemakers will speak individually.
Right. So in a story I wrote about the Eola Amity Hills, both of these wines come from the Eola Amity Hills. And in a story I wrote about them, I described the Eola Amity Hills as kind of the catcher's mitt for the Van Duzer corridor winds. And you can see it on the map there. It's plain as day. You can see that corridor where the Van Duzer corridor AVA kind of fans out. The winds all play straight into the belly of the appellation. It is sort of like an island in and of itself. It is a number of small hills rising out of the plain of the valley floor, and it is a melange of soils. Both Jory and Willackenzie soils or both sedimentary and volcanic soils, I should say, are found in the Aola Amity Hills, and many of them are dramatically. Many of them are combined or are dramatically shallow in some instances. So it is two things. It's a cooler place, and it's a place where the soils are much more challenging for vines to grow to mature properly. And so there's a tremendous additional tension and stress that goes on in the wines here. We're going to start with the first one.
And let's go ahead and reveal wine 3 as we're doing that for those of you who
Yep.
are playing along in the blind tasting game. It's from Matzinger Davies, and Anna Matzinger will be joining us shortly.
Yes, this is a lovely wine composed of 2 different vineyard sources, both of them very shallow soil, to my understanding, and they are they're showing this tremendous kind of tannic oomph to them that the other wines haven't really possessed to this point. And what we're talking about is, or what reveals to me is a kind of that shallow soiled structure that goes along with Aola. Anna, I know you're using 2 different vineyards in this wine. So let's talk a little bit about those wines and tell us a little bit about Matzinger Davies.
Hello, thank you. Nice to be here. I'm Anna Matzinger. First, let's talk about these vineyards, actually, since we've been talking about the Van Duzer corridor. When looking at this picture now that we can see the vineyard on the right-hand side without the hat, that's up at Larry and Robin Lynn Wheeler's property. That's called Three Trees Vineyard, and you are looking right down and over and to that little gap in, well, kind of a big gap, a gap in the Coast Range and out towards the Pacific. So our Pinot Noir for the Aola Amity Hills comes from these 2 vineyards. They have some commonalities. One is that they are both kind of located, if you imagine the map back in your mind, that kind of northern knuckle of the Aola Amity Hills. They are both pretty high up at 700 to 750 feet in elevation. And just to give you a frame of reference, I'm sitting here in McMinnville, and we're at about 40 feet in elevation. So, you know, pretty high up. I would say 15 years ago, 20 years ago, these vineyards were both planted in the mid-90s. That was pretty darn high. They're both family farmed. They're both less than 2 acres. Fun fact, both of the men they're both retired now, but they used to work at Garmin in Salem, so GPS company. So engineers during the week and engineering, creative-minded gentlemen farmers on the weekend. Both sedimentary soils, but here's where they start to diverge. Three Trees, the one you can see on the right, you know, that gets the brunt of those winds that come through, as Morgan was saying, kind of every day. 3 o'clock in the afternoon, you feel the cooling breeze from the Pacific. You can't quite see the Pacific from there, but you definitely can feel it. The soil here is a little bit thinner, and it's much stonier and bonier. And I think, you know, it creates a wine that's a little more bony and a little more structured, brings some great tannin into the blend. And then Poco Vineyard on the left, that's basically at the top of the hill. It's actually sloping just gently northwards. So it's more protected. The soil, as you can see, is not really stony at all. It's a little bit thicker, a little bit deeper. And the fruit has a lot less tannin, a lot more sort of juiciness and succulence and density. So putting those 2 together feels like, you know, a nice full package. It's the bones and the flesh, which sounds a little Frankenstein, but
it's a really beautiful wine, and I think it reflects the structure that goes along with both the wind and that soil structure that gives you this sense that this is a much more structured wine than what we've gone before it. And I dare say that the Domaine Drouin Rose Rock has a structure that is at least analogous, Aaron, do you want to take it up from here? I think that to taste these two wines together is really important because they really do amount to a side-by-side comparison of two wines from the same appellation.
Yeah, so this is just spoiler alert again to keep the going.
Sorry.
So that's all right. That's all right. It's all fun. We're all having fun here in Zealand. So this is from Domaine Drouin, and Aaron Bell is the winemaker there, is going to talk us through it. So we're in the same appellation, and it'll be interesting to try the two wines side by side, see how interpretation is different, but there's obviously a strong thread of commonality through both of them.
And yeah, there will be a commonality for sure. I guess to give you a little reference, we would be kind of we're in the southern portion of the Yosemite Hills, Rose Rock. We'd be kind of just below the belt line from north to south, if feet were being in the south portion of the Yosemite Hills. A vineyard, you're looking at the vineyard there, was planted in 2003 and 2004. And if many people know us, Domaine Drouin, we've been making wine in the Dundee Hills since 1987. I've had the pleasure of working for and with the family since 2002. So this will be my 20th vintage here. And our new adventure was what's next for us. We believe in Oregon, meaning the family, myself. And so in 2013, this vineyard that was already existing went for sale, and we thought it was, we loved what's happening in the Yola Hills and what the potential is. And so anyways, the rest is history. We've been making wine from the property since 2014. As you can see, it's actually conveniently broken up to 40 parcels, some of them being 4 parcels of Chardonnay and then about 35, 36 parcels of Pinot Noir. Our curiosity, as we do in Burgundy, as we do at Domaine Drouin, we ferment every single one of those parcels separately and barrel them separately. We're trying to get to know this piece of property, what each area wants to be, kind of quote unquote, when it grows up. And so what the Zephyrin that you have in front of you is our rendition of what we feel is the best 10% from the property. So this is a barrel selection from selected parcels within the property. This property will give us about 650 barrels of Pinot Noir in a given vintage, and we're choosing about 60 to 65 barrels to become this wine. Speaking to the wine, Rose Rock, it is quite funny. There's definitely a blue, kind of darker fruit, a little more structure to it. This is a very shallow vineyard as far as soil. It's volcanic, but it's Nakaya soil. So it's actually, you can, in the Dundee Hills, you can go down 60 inches before you hit parent material. But here you can go sometimes 10 inches and you're going to start to hit basalt parent rock. I think in that you get a little more structure to the wine, but there's something that's just incredibly, maybe it's suggestive to the name, but there's something so floral to the Rose Rock wines. We'd be seeing in the Chardonnay more white flowered fruit, or white flowered the Rose Rock wines. We'd be seeing in the Chardonnay more white flowered fruit, or white flowered wine, but in this we see just a florality to it that we see year in and year out. 2018 vintage, a little bit cool in the spring. Our bud break was just a touch late. We had a nice warm summer. And then our September was actually quite cooled off quite quickly. And we got about 200% of normal rainfall. So we had a good amount of rain, which is not necessarily bad. We had a very dry summer. And I think you see in the wine, I think 18s will be known, I guess Oregon's known, but 18 for sure is just the textural ride you'll get from 18 Pinot Noirs from Oregon.
So compare for us, please, the two properties, which are from very, very different sites. The Domaine Drouin, Oregon, is in the Dundee Hills and in the kernel of the Dundee Hills, and then this is in the Aola Amity Hills. Let's start with harvest dates. They must be. Are they similar, or do they diverge dramatically?
I snuck and got my harvest book. Start date from the Aola Hills to the Dundee Hills. Dundee Hills started 12 days earlier.
12 days. Okay.
12 days earlier, and then we picked a little bit of Chardonnay, but just comparing Pinot. We didn't start the harvest in Rose Rock. We started on the 22nd of September in the Dundee Hills. We didn't start till the 4th of October, 3rd, 4th of October.
And obviously climate must have something to do with that. Does the soil structure also contribute to that delay in ripeness?
Yes, I think so. But the biggest factor is what we've all talked about and mentioned is the Van Duzer. We can have very similar daytime temperatures, maybe a couple degrees cooler in Rose Rock versus the Dundee Hills or the Durham Estate. But in the evening, you're always about 2 hours faster. You're going to go to your low time temperature faster by about 2 hours.
Okay.
Comes out by 100 days, and there you have that about 12 days between ripening of the sites. It is a cooler site, maybe not at midday, but by, as we were saying, 2:30, maybe 4:30, at the Rose Rock Vineyard, to start to cool off and get those winds. And that there's just this huge in the acid profile of wine. And that really, for me, that really is what the defining difference between the kind of dark, more brooding fruit you can get from the Eola Hills versus that more red, plush fruit you can get from the Dundee Hills. And in my opinion, speaking of just the AVAs, you mentioned at the very beginning, for me, yes, I mean, it's kind of proven historically as far as, start dates of the Eola Hills versus the Dundee Hills, at least for us, historically from 14, the Dundee Hills is a warmer area than the Eola Hills because of that Van Duzer wind.
It's very interesting, Aaron, and I would reflect this back to Anna as well. And I don't know if it's power of suggestion, but there's a strong florality in both of this pair as opposed to the first pair. And rose petal is actually what I wrote down as my notes on Anna's wine. Yours seems to have that too. Is this sort of florality typical of the Eola Amity Hills, or it just seems to be, was it brought out by the vintage, by 18 being, say, warmer than 2017?
I think it is a floral area. You think of wines from this area, Christum, Bethel Heights, these wines that have power structure, dark fruited, but always have a beautiful flowery to them. Like some of the most collectible wines in Oregon are, that I personally collect are those, for those reasons. There is something unique to, I think, the florality of that area versus the Dundee Hills. You can get some florality, but you tend to get more spice and more fruit driven wines in the Eola Hills in the Dundee Hills than you do necessarily in the Eola Hills. That florality, I think, shows itself more in the Eola Hills.
It's a really exciting comparison. I'm very happy with the way these two play against each other and show very similar tendencies, despite being in fairly different soil series as well. So,
well, great. Yeah, I was going to say, Patrick, I mean, so far, and it should be noted that both last week for California and this week for Patrick, they've selected the wines. I mean, the curation here, the narrative that you have created, both by your selection of wines and the sequencing of the wines, I hope is something that everybody out there is really enjoying, because this is a masterclass of terroir through the great state of Oregon and and the Willamette Valley. So we have one final pair, so people should start tasting wines 5 and 6 together, and we're going to move into the Dundee Hills specifically, back there for this 5th wine. Patrick, over to you.
So we're back in the Dundee Hills, and we're back in a region that is squarely Jory soils, iron-rich soils. They speak of the red hills of Dundee, and when I taste wines from Dundee, there's always this kind of light red tone to the wines, and I picked that up here. There's this particular wine is sort of almost radiating redness to me, and I think it's such a beautiful, demonstrative red-fruited character.
Spoiler alert: Domaine Roy. For those
is.
of you who are following along.
Right.
Okay.
Right. I have one thing to say about the site, and then I'm going to toss it over to Jared, whom I've never met, and I'm excited to talk about this brand. This is a relatively new brand, but the vineyard is called Iron Filbert. The wine is called Incline, and Iron Filbert is in what has to be considered the Grand Cru of the Dundee Hills, because it is on this area called Warden Hill Road, and there is such a powerhouse of wineries in and around. Jared, tell us about your neighbors. They're it's just a remarkable group of winemakers, and these wines always seem to reflect kind of the most that beautiful kind of internal luminous radiance of redness that even more so than other parts of the Dundee Hills, and I'm finding that very much to be the case here. So Jared, hello and welcome. Tell us a little bit about Domaine Roy et Fils, and the Fils part is important as I understand it.
Yeah. So we purchased the property in 2013, and the impetus for starting the project was a continuation of the second generations of two families coming together, working together. My father, Mike Etzel, started Beaufrere Winery with the planting of Beaufrere in '86, and he ended up partnering with Robert Roy. And Domaine Roy was started when Mark Roy called me up and said, "Hey, what do you think about starting a new project together, since we're not getting the action in Beaufrere, and our old men are not retiring, and so we should do something." I said, "It sounds phenomenal if we find the right terroir." And it was just by luck of timing that we came across this property, and it was perfect. And we jumped on the opportunity to convert the property from a filbert orchard. It was one of the last filbert orchards on Warden Hill Road. And so the naming of it, Iron Filbert Vineyard, we wanted to pay homage to the filberts, which have been very important to Dundee for so long. And iron because it's Jory, and Jory is a very iron-rich red soil, as you discussed before. And I think the wine is quite transparent and true to Dundee, with that huge amount of red berry fruit and a little bit of a sanguine character. The incline specifically in our lineup comes from the southernmost portion of this vineyard, which is a 300-foot elevation ranging up to about 510. And this southern portion, so it's around 350-ish, 400 feet elevation, is mainly this RG rootstock, which tends to push the ripening a little bit earlier. We even have more flamboyant, as I would say, fruit than our midsection of the vineyard is planted on 10114, but rootstock that's a little deeper, ripens slower. So yeah, I love this vintage. 18 was, as was mentioned before, super warm vintage, super dry, pretty much a perfect growing season, but you can never, I guess, be perfect. The problems with 18 were I don't know, I guess you got to look at everything with humor, but we had yellow jackets that came after the fruit. Thank God we have a great sorting line. We were able to sort with about 14 people any berries that were broken open by these yellow jackets. So very ripe fruit, but attractive to bees. And the other weird thing with the 18 vintage was there was a vole pandemic where these field mice essentially are going after the base of the vines, girdling these vines, and so it was a mad struggle and rush to figure out how to stop the voles, from cultivating the rows to putting out little water containers for them, because it was so dry they didn't have water, so they turned to the vines to girdle the base to get water. So we cultivate to try to disrupt their habitat and have them go over into the woods or into a grassy area. And then we set out water. We did so many things. It had its challenge, just like any vintage, but really, really ripe year, and super flamboyant fruit, really fun wines, one of my favorites. And
Beautiful
the
wine.
vintage holds a special place in my heart as well, because it was the first year that I worked with Erica, who is now my wife. and we worked vintage together. And then a little over a year later, we ended up getting married. So
Congratulations.
yeah. So
Great story.
It's worth your while to compare it with, go back to wine number one and compare the two, just to kind of have a bookended look at how Dundee plays out, or what the range of flavors that you can expect from Jory soils. I know Jason said that these are not, Sisters isn't strictly speaking 100% Jory, but they remain kind of bookends for the appellation in a very real sense. Beautiful wine. We really look forward to seeing what you guys do in the future. I think that the future is bright, and it's very, very young right now for you all. Did you learn everything that you know about winemaking from your father?
I learned a lot from my dad, and I think foundationally a lot of what we do is quite similar. Organic farming, and then I would say low input winemaking, and that there's really nothing added to the wine except for a small amount of sulfur.
Okay.
And that foundationally is very important to our style. You know, the difference being our terroir is red and my father's is the Willackenzie soil,
Right.
and he has older vines. But beyond that, our styles are quite similar. I did get to work in many other places than the Willamette Valley. I worked in Napa. I also worked in Spain a bit. And I guess you take a little bit from everywhere that you get to experience and piece it together.
Absolutely. And the success, you know, what's interesting, just as a segue to our final wine, what's really amazing about Oregon, and we don't see it frankly as much here in California where I live, Jared, is there seems to be a happiness factor in lineage. So a lot of the first families, if you will, in Oregon Pinot Noir, whether it's the Campbells or the Letts or whatever, are passing it down to the next generation, and doing so happily. And as we happen to have so much dysfunction often at times when that happens in California, but it seems to be a very normal and very French Burgundian thing where oftentimes generations pass on and it's just done seamlessly. And it shows here. And obviously, you know, you're cutting your own path and your own cloth here and doing so with such aplomb. I'm so pleased to try this wine. I was not familiar with it prior to this tasting, and thank Patrick profusely for selecting it. Thank you so much. And we have one more wine to go. I want to make sure that our last wine and our last winemaker gets an opportunity to speak from Yamhill Carlton. And Patrick, take it away and introduce
Sure.
our final speaker.
Well, this wine is the last one because it feels to me in many respects the wine with the most depth and structure. I don't like to use the word power when I'm speaking of any Oregon wine, but this one has a kind of force to it that many of that will be distinct from many of the other wines we've tried today. We'll talk a little bit about the soil series in a moment, but Yamhill Carlton is primarily devoted to sedimentary soil series, and this is really showing that part of the depth is winemaking, but part of the depth is also the way sedimentary soils often play in a wine in a good vintage. And this wine is showing this dark fruit tone and dark berry with a kind of intensity that is buoyed nicely by acidity, but it remains kind of like this as opposed to like that. It's exciting stuff.
And spoiler alert reveal on our last wine is another winery that was new to me, Patrick. And again, thank you for selecting and providing an opportunity and exposure for all. This is from Big Table Farm, and Claire Carver's with us today too. I'm so delighted.
Claire, welcome. Your vineyard, your farm, the Big Table Farm, is situated in the Yamhill Carlton AVA, but this is not yet from your estate. So tell us a little bit about the vineyard and tell us about your future plans at the farm.
Yeah, I assume everyone can hear me. I love Yamhill Carlton fruit, and I'm so happy that by luck and circumstance, we ended up there. There's a picture on everybody's screen. You can see that's a very recent picture, and that's our new vineyard that we've just planted. So that is at the farm and homestead where our home is, and all of my animals and our winery. It's all in one place. And the marine sediment in our soil, I actually was just on the hill with our new assistant winemaker, Vince, yesterday, and we have some creative vole traps. So Jared, ask me later, I'll tell you about our new wacky thing we're doing for voles. And we had just put a new gate in, and when they had dug down, there was all this white marine sediment that was sort of scattered all over the ground. And I picked it up in my hand. I said, look, Vince, I had no idea there was this much sediment this low on our site, because the gate's at the very bottom. So it's always kind of thrilling to think about promise when you're planting a vineyard, because it's such a long game. So our vines went in this spring. We started the planning of our vineyard 15 years ago when we bought the property. So it was a long time coming. And we should see our first fruit from those vines in a couple more years. So that's what's going on the home site. But this particular wine is actually from 3 different vineyards that are all in the Yamhill Carlton AVA. It is a barrel selection. So it's one of our top tier cuvées, and Brian goes through and tastes Brian and I go through and taste all the barrels from these particular sites, and then choose the ones that best represent the Yamhill Carlton AVA. So I think it bears, Patrick, you talked a little bit about winemaker's hand. And I think that does show in this wine. Our wines are 100% whole cluster and have been for a very long time. And they're all wild yeast, natural mallow, and unfined and unfiltered. One thing that was interesting when Morgan was talking at the very beginning, we've been working with the Johann fruit since the 2007 vintage, and I just love the Johann fruit. So it's nice to have Morgan on this call, and it's just, the Johann fruit is beautiful, but it's totally different than the Yamhill fruit. And Patrick, you also talked about this fruit being really dark, and what I always think of when I think of Yamhill Carlton fruit is the wild cherries that grow here. They're not like cherries you get at the grocery store. They're really dark, red black color, and they're very small. They don't have very much flesh and a really big seed, and they are this like deep extracted flavor that I really think comes through in the Yamhill Carlton expression.
Beautiful, beautiful wine.
Brian
Marcy is Claire's husband and winemaker, or titular winemaker. Both of them come from Napa, and I often think that your wines sort of brought a bit of California sunshine to Oregon vineyards, because there really is a luminosity to these wines that I absolutely adore. Also, I can't remember, is your farm open to the public?
It is no
by
longer.
appointment? Oh, okay.
Yeah, we used to host at the farm, and we got a little overwhelmed because it was too much. So now
it's too beautiful. That's the reason. It's such a beautiful place.
Well, thank you. We now have a beautiful in-town location that I'm sitting at right now, and it's called the Atelier, and it's called that because it's also my painting studio. So those of you who don't know my brand, I'm an artist, and I draw all of these labels. They're different every year for every wine, and I'm an oil painter, a pretty serious one. So that's one of my oil paintings behind me. And when you come to do a private tasting here in Carlton, you're walking right through my art studio into the private back room to sit down for an hour.
Awesome.
How cool is that? How cool is that? Well, Claire, along with our other vintners, is going to be joining us momentarily in our happy half hour. And before we sort of close here and open it up to everybody, a couple of thoughts. First of all, thank you, everybody. Thank you on the joining us end, the participant end. Thank you on the winemaker end for joining us today. Thank you, Patrick, for leading us through this extraordinarily well-curated bespoke tasting that was put together for us, which is great. As a reminder, for those people who just got this one but want to see what we did in California with Josh and myself last week, please come onto our blog site in there and you can see it posted. Our regular monthly kits will be coming out shortly. You can purchase them soon, and our webinar will be on the 14th. And as in closing, and then I'm going to ask everybody to turn it on, and perhaps everyone can even turn on. All winemakers can join us, and all the participants who would like to be seen can join us as well too. Patrick, if I were to ask people to walk away from this session with today, and that sort of coming back to what we spoke of earlier at the very beginning as the Oregonness of these wines, based on what we've said today, what should be like the 2 or 3 things people should be looking for in an Oregon wine, in a Willamette Valley wine, and maybe even, you know, in some of these appellations specifically, a bullet or 2 that they can keep in their brain for future application?
Sure. I mean, the climate is getting to be such a factor in all of the vineyards of the West Coast that climate is going to one day soon trump just about any expression of vineyard character, or at least dominate the discussion. I think that one of the things that we learned today, and we've looked at 2 vintages, but still, you are looking at such a great variation of tone, of body, of levels of elegance, levels of earthiness and style, all of which kind of describe the kind of the variety and the wide range that you can expect from Oregon Pinot Noir. So Oregon Pinot Noir is a thing, one thing, but once you dig down even a slightest level in to beneath the surface, you realize that there are so many different iterations, and that's what's really exciting. So you can explore Oregon all your life, and you're always going to come up with something new, and that's really the exciting thing. I mean, as for the Oregonness of these wines, I think that they all showed it to a great extent, but within that, we've got variations in spades, which is exciting.